The situation with climate change is clear. The crisis is not being managed in the way it needs to be managed at the moment. I am Sir Dave King. I have set up a climate crisis advisory group. The group represents the international experts on climate change to be available to the public, to policymakers, and to the media around the world. We need action now. What we as humanity do over the next 5 years will, in my view, determine the future of civilization.
Hello and welcome to our monthly public meeting. Now, it feels like diplomacy season is well and truly underway. Last week, New York was home to both Climate Week and the UN General Assembly. I know a number of our members were in town, and it sounds like mixed reviews on the outcomes as ever. CCAG's focus is now firmly on the run-up to COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. A COP taking place in Africa must surely shine a light on the continent, not just the issues that it's facing, but also the ingenuity and solutions that it holds. Today, we're going to address this in part as we consider what a post-carbon future might look like. We want to know, what can the global south do to get us there, and how can they be supported by the world's wealthiest nations, and most importantly, what are the opportunities that lie in a post-carbon world? Today, we are delighted to be joined by sustainability consultant and former candidate on BBC's The Apprentice, Francesca Kennedy-Walbank, Senior Environmental Affairs Officer at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, Linus Maffor, and Senior Associate and former Director at the International Institute for Environment and Development, Camilla Tormin. We'll hopefully also be joined by Adam Vaughan, Environment Editor at The Times. But to kick things off today, I'd like to hand over to Dr. Fatima Denton, who has recently launched After Carbon, a post-carbon policy and research hub that will bring together scientists, civil society groups, entrepreneurs, and public sector officials into a research program that will respond to the Global South's most compelling priorities for a green transition. Fatima, I am absolutely fascinated by your work here, so I'm going to hand over to you to tell us more.
Thank you very much, Ade. I think you asked a very relevant question in your introduction about what can the Global South do, and I can definitely say that the Global South can do a lot. But I think us as a community, in terms of our aspirations, our ambition towards a net zero world, is going to result into almost net zero if we're not prepared. So our preparedness for a post-carbon economy is very important. It's very critical. And I believe that if we don't prepare ourselves, it's almost like we're sailing without a compass. We really do need to prepare. And I think it's even more pressing and more urgent, I'd say, for the Global South, especially countries in Africa. I mean, this is something that we all know, that this is the continent that is really facing the climate assault in very dire ways. It's in the front line. And therefore, the continent does need to take a look at how it is preparing itself. It's also the continent that is least prepared in terms of the resources that it needs to reverse the impacts of climate change. Less prepared also in terms of the infrastructure that it needs. To some extent, that's a double-edged sword because it's an advantage and a disadvantage. But also less prepared because the responses are there in Africa, but they're very fragmented. The knowledge is there, but it's very fragmented. So at the scale in which we need to pool knowledge, that lack of preparation might end up eating into the opportunities or really compromising the opportunities that we have. Yet we're basically saying with After Carbon, which is an African facility for transition research, we're saying that here is an opportunity to get that preparedness, in place. We're saying that this is the case because this is a continent that has several transition aces. If you look at our carbon footprint, it's less than 3%. So therefore, we don't need to basically start all over again or basically retrofit our institutions and infrastructure because it's not in place yet. So we're building from that, and therefore we have a wonderful opportunity to start fresh and to start green. And to use the word that Sir David mentioned, to leapfrog. We also have the second largest rainforest, about 1.2 billion tons of CO2 every year. There's hopefully going to be a discussion about green minerals and how important these are. We have 46 out of those 66 minerals that are going to be essential for the fourth industrial revolution, but also essential for scaling up renewable. And most of those are home to the continent. So we've got a wonderful, I would say, potential, leapfrogging potential in the continent. We are also got 60% of the world arable land. But we have a huge challenge because we have to move people from the dire situation of poverty. And obviously we're in this sort of multi-pronged crisis world at the moment, and that's having an impact everywhere. And Africa is very, very much in the front line again. So we've got to be able to move to food insecurity to food secure world. We've got to be able to move from energy insecurity to energy efficiency, and several other things that are transitional levers that we can pull. So essentially, we are trying to see how across this platform, which hopefully will bring key stakeholders on board, that we can look at this as almost a knowledge platform, but not essentially a research. Research takes a long time. The continent hasn't got time to wait for long, research solutions. We basically want to look at some of the compelling problems, as you mentioned, Ade. And these compelling problems, they are in all kinds of different shades, and they are regarding the emergence of hydrogen, or rather, it's not a novelty, but what do we do with hydrogen? How do we take advantage of it? We have to look at issues like natural gas. I have to say that my colleagues are just coming from the field, and there's a strong push, obviously, towards a greener future, but there's a strong resistance. This is not something that most policymakers are pushing forward in Africa. In the different countries that we are, where we're talking to policymakers there, they definitely feel that they have resources, they have sovereignty, and they can exploit their resources. And so it's not a pressing problem for them in the same way that it's a pressing problem for the rest of the world. So we have to look at those sort of differences, and they're quite entrenched even as we speak. So we're basically saying there are opportunities for green transition, there are opportunities for job creation. We have something called the African Continental Free Trade Area. It's in essence the largest trading bloc in the world, because it will bring together 1.3 billion people together in 55 different countries in Africa, with over the potential of lifting 30 million people out of poverty. So if the AFCFTA can get it right in terms of a new beginning, where they can actually look at ways of enabling green development and green future, and perhaps even looking at some of these solutions around hydrogen, then that's a big market, not to mention the other mineral resources that we have in terms of rare earth minerals. But again, since this is a continent that has been prone to predation, we have to tread carefully. And it's not just predation from outside. There is also a sense that a lot of these resources haven't really gone to the economy at large, and it's been a bit of an enclave economy. So we really want to see how these new minerals are going to make a difference in the lives of people. But essentially, if I could just say one last word and finish, is to say that the After Carbon is definitely about solutions oriented. It's about a platform that brings people together. It doesn't assume it has all the answers, but it's about looking at practical ways of solving the problems. And it's a very dynamic approach in the sense that, by bringing different stakeholders together, the solutions are almost going in a circular manner. You are ensuring that if you're looking at issues around plastics, that you are retailing some of the solutions to the private sector, but the public sector also has a role to play in terms of looking for the right regulatory framework that would enable the new policies to set in. So this is essentially what After Carbon is, but it's very much a hands-on. It's meant to be a very dynamic action hub that we hope will be able to find some solutions, because we are assuming we have the answers, we're assuming we're prepared, but there's poor preparation can be very injurious, I'd say, to our aspirations for green future.
Yeah, Fatima, thank you for that. It was absolutely fascinating. So much in that little section there, Fatima. I don't even know where to begin, but it was a really interesting insight. And some of the top lines that I'm getting from it is the fact that Africa has the power, and it always has the power and the potential to lead the way to a greener future, but it's how we do this and how we enable Africa to do it in the best way possible, and also taking into account that Africa is a very diverse continent with many nations, and it's going to take a lot to get them all to work together and pull in the right direction. But really interesting and fascinating to see what happens when it comes to enabling the global South nations to build a low carbon development and achieve net zero. Okay, it's time for me to move over and hand on to our guests. And as always, I'd like to invite you all to ask one question. And if we got time, we'll circle back for any additional questions. First up, I'd like to give the floor to Linus Maffor. Linus, we'd love to hear more about the work you do at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. Would you please give us some insights into this, along with your question for the panel today?
Thank you very much, Ade. And I want to thank CCAG for inviting me to this wonderful setting. It is also wonderful to see wonderful people like Sir David we've met before here, and to see my former boss, Dr. Fatima Denson, my role model as well, and to see Camilla. Nice to see you also. Really thank you. And it's a wonderful conversation, as you mentioned, Ade, and Fatima has really done a wonderful setting, looking at the opportunities that are there in the global South, especially in Africa, for the green, the beyond carbon green future. And this issue about minerals is really critical. I'm from the African Climate Policy Center, as I said, a senior environmental affairs officer. We support countries under three core functions of think tank, convening, and advisory services on climate resilient policies, which include the transition agenda. And when you mention about the opportunities in the South for the green future, and looking at what Fatima mentioned about the minerals, electric batteries are going to be central, right? And Fatima mentioned about 46 of the critical minerals being in Africa. And I think there is another additional number that 15 countries or so globally have these minerals, and 8 of them are in Africa and so on. So last year, the Economic Commission for Africa, together with Afrexim Bank and African Development Bank and Africa Finance Corporation, commissioned Bloomberg to do a study on how can Africa really beneficiate from this and capitalize on this green future. Because at the moment, for example, DRC produces or supplies 70% of global cobalt, but only captures 3% of that value because it's just different ships. But we're saying that if you can start producing electric battery precursors in Africa, that studies show that you can do it 30% cheaper in DRC, capitalizing on the Africa Continental Free Trade that Fatima mentioned, because you also have Zambia, Madagascar, Tanzania, and so on. So it is a wonderful opportunity that the green future presents for Africa. But I would like to ask the panel, how can we go to this green future in a compelling and credible way? And in that relation, I want to ask them, do you believe that natural gas is a compelling and credible a necessary transition fuel for a future carbon future? And I ask this in the sense that Africa has got a very low energy access rate, a huge energy deficit gap. 80% of the people globally without access to electricity, and in Africa, 37% of the 2.4 billion people without access to clean cooking are in Africa. Africa's installed electricity capacity is so small. Africa consumes only 3.7% of global primary energy, and so on. All the numbers, all the statistics in energy show that Africa is very low. So there's a huge opportunity for Africa to transition to this green future, but the question is how? And therefore, I'm asking the panel, do they believe that natural gas is a compelling and necessary transition for that green future? Thank you, Adi.
Thank you, Linus. So it's a really, really pertinent question, because one of the things we should always bear into account is to move to a greener future. People are involved and they're going to be affected by these changes. I'm going to go over to Sir Dave King on this one, first of all, please.
Thank you, Ade, and thank you very much, Linus, for the question. I'm going to first of all say, if any country is involved in green growth and climate resilience, and there are 3 African countries, I believe, that currently have green growth and climate resilience embedded right across their government policy program. In any of these countries, what has to be understood is that green growth follows through a pathway of improving financial benefits to that country, improving the growth in terms of GDP and in terms of well-being. And each of those countries I'm referring to now have followed through that policy. Now, I think it is very important that everyone understands that if we watch Africa use gas as a transition to that net zero policy in 2050, this could be an economic disaster for the very simple reason that the infrastructure needs to be invested in, and you put in the infrastructure, and the infrastructure will only pay back over the following decades. Infrastructure typically lasts many decades. If you are importing infrastructure and you're importing the gas into your country, this is going to be very, very bad for your economic growth. There is an alternative, and that is to look at local energy sources. And the local energy sources in Africa are rather abundant. Whether we're looking at solar or we're looking at wind, there is an abundance of local energy sources. There are other sources, but let's stay with those 2. If you invest in those, you will find that at today's market prices, the building costs of the renewable energy systems per kilowatt hour produced are much, much cheaper than going for traditional gas turbines. So there are several reasons for this, one of which is that the market globally has pulled the price right down. And so in Britain here, what is the cheapest form of electricity production? It is offshore wind. And offshore wind sounds like the most expensive way to go, but it is actually cheaper than gas-fired turbine as a means of creating new electricity production. The second thing is that the development process is not only cheaper, but it's a very good employer. So if we take solar, we know that installation is one part of that employment process, but the second part is maintenance. And so here in the UK, the same applies. If we look at the maintenance of our offshore wind, that is keeping jobs going for many, many people. And I'm going to tell you that in Britain, the renewable energy sector is the fastest growing part of our economy. I know our economy isn't doing very well, but it is the fastest growing part. So we just need to bear in mind that the reality is You can grow your economy more quickly by investing in infrastructure that is fit for purpose in the 21st century, rather than in infrastructure that will not pay back. You will be creating what the economists are calling a stranded asset by going down that route. Now, that may not be true for every part of Africa. Right? We can't just broadly say what is best for every country, which is why I say the most important thing is economic growth and the well-being of the people. But I do believe this is the route to deliver that.
Fascinating answer there, Sir David. Thank you for that. I'd like to hear Dr. Fatima Denton. I'd like to hear your perspective on this question as well, please.
Thank you very much, Ade. I think Sir David has said quite a lot that would resonate with some people in Africa, but not most of the people that we talk to. Certainly, most of the people that we talk to are looking at this from an economic perspective. You take countries like Nigeria, where a significant part of the economic revenue is coming from the exploitation of oil and gas, especially gas also. And I think that looking at this future and the current demand in gas, I think gas prices have increased more than, I'd say, three times in the past 12 months. And if you look at the situation that's happening now with the Ukrainian-Russian war, African countries are looking at this from a very different perspective right now. They see a very important opportunity here. I think there are issues around security, there are issues around safety, and there are issues around infrastructure. As Sir David said, the infrastructure takes a long time to put in place. And even with all the resources that countries in Africa have, most of them do not have the refinery infrastructure. And putting that in place would take at least 20 to 30 years, so that could be used in a better way. But I think that the dominant thinking is that Africa feels that it has been left behind a little bit because the absence, well, not absence, but the fact that the energy poverty is so prevalent in this continent has held back the manufacturing industry. So all of the countries in Africa have got a huge industrialization aspiration. They all want to industrialize, and they think that natural gas is going to get them there faster. Countries like Tanzania have got, and they're finding these resources as we speak. They've got tremendous amount of natural gas that they are thinking they could commercialize within their sub-region. So these are the realities on the ground. The realities on the ground is that, yes, beyond the industrialization aspect, there is also the aspect of agriculture, because, you can also get fertilizers from natural gas, and that could also be an input to agricultural productivity. So some of the potential, I'd say, challenges that Sir David mentioned, which are all through, are not the things that are top on the sort of policy radar of African policymakers right now. They see a resource that needs to be exploited. And to be honest, they also say that the motto of development in the world, and especially in the West, has been carbon. It has been natural gas. So I don't think it's a matter of just making sure that they just go ahead and do the same thing. They realize that would not be to their advantage. But they're saying that this is what has gotten the rest of the world where it is today, especially the West. So there's a behavioral and a paradigm shift that needs to happen. And I do not think it would go away very soon, in spite of all the arguments that Sir David has laid out. Now that we're seeing this problem in Ukraine, other countries in the West are also looking for alternative sources. So that's also part of the problem. I mean, you can only sell something if there is a buyer and a seller. So as long as there's going to be a demand for it, countries in Africa are already putting themselves, they're lining up to be that alternative source of natural gas, including Mozambique, including Senegal, that has also just discovered natural gas. And they have every intention of taking advantage of this resource.
Dr. Fatima Denton, I mean, that was a really interesting answer. I'd like to sort of hear your thoughts as well, Linus, because there were so many important points there. You know, the energy poverty that many Africans face, but then also you put that against what Sir David King mentioned about creating stranded assets in the future, you know, and then also, can we get that mindset of seeing going green as something that is positive, that is going to create growth? There are many, many questions that need to be unpacked there. And from your perspective, what do you feel, Linus?
No, thank you. Thank you very much, Ade. Here at the Economic Commission for Africa, the African Climate Policy Center, we believe that the energy transition narrative should be compelling and credible. So David has made a very strong, compelling case for it, which we all support. And Dr. Denton has also brought in the aspects of the credibility part of it. Now, if you want to do more renewables, okay, we said Africa, energy poverty in Africa is so high, right? Energy consumption in Africa is so low. Globally, a typical American will consume about 13,000 kilowatt hours per person per annum. In Africa, it's about 600. If you take away North Africa and South Africa, it's about 200. How can you close development gaps with that level of development? So the new thinking that you need a minimum consumption of at least 1,000 kilowatt hours per person in Africa if we're going to really address development goals, the SDGs and so on. But that means that starting from a very low base, Africa can do a lot of renewables, right? Because we have, as I mentioned earlier, the electricity capacity of Africa is very low. But if you're going to increase consumption to 1,000 kilowatts per person per annum, you're going to have to add a lot of capacity, which can come from renewables. But the fact of the matter is that for increased shares of renewables that include wind and solar that are variable, there is a limit. Even the European grid that is so strong has a limit to how much wind and solar you can bring to it, because the minute that the sun goes down or the wind stops blowing, something has to come in, right? Dispatchable power has to come in. You get dispatchable power from hydro and gas, okay? And Europe has that. They have the capacity market. They have all of those things that are there to balance and stabilize the grid. When Africa hasn't got a strong grid to start with, the limited grid that it has can only take a certain amount of renewables. So the credible case is that we need to have investments in base generation in strong grids that can accept large shares of wind in the absence of storage. Because at the moment, storage is still very expensive. We don't know how long it will take for storage to become affordable. So in the absence of that, in the absence of these investments in huge infrastructures, we have interconnectors in Africa, like one between Tanzania, Kenya, and Zambia, that could basically link North Africa and South Africa. And if you did that, you will be able to now balance supply and demand. That is one of the ways that you can also balance that variability. Those things are not there at the moment. So with that low base generation, it makes sense for African countries to invest in, especially given that many African countries have natural gas anyway, to invest in natural gas to strengthen the base generation so that you can have more variable renewables. Without a strong base generation, you cannot have more variable renewables. And then, of course, Fatima mentioned in the introduction about hydrogen. Green hydrogen is one area that Africa has got a huge potential in. And therefore, Africa can tap its vast renewable energy resources to produce green hydrogen. But that green hydrogen can then have the gas infrastructure that has been invested in repurposed for green hydrogen. And big equipment manufacturers have said you can repurpose gas turbines to run on hydrogen. The infrastructure can be used. So it is a strategy that Africa can use to invest in gas to strengthen the base generation, increase the capacity, or increase access, and then at the same time, go towards a strong push to bring more renewables. Because now when you have a strong base generation, you can bring more renewables, and then also go for a strong agenda for green hydrogen so that you can now use that infrastructure, phase it out in about 30 years, and become a green continent.
Thank you, Linus. Yeah, I mean, this is a question that's going to rage on, and I think we need to come back to this in future CCAG meetings. I'd like to quickly, Mark, I know, Professor Mark Maslin, you'd like to quickly chip on this if you can, please.
So I was really interested in what Linus was saying, but I think one of the things that Africa has is a lack of infrastructure and centralization. So renewables, interestingly enough, lead themselves to decentralization. So it's much easier to build renewables in the middle of a country that doesn't have a grid. So I think in that way, we should really prioritize getting into the rural areas, getting energy and using that. Yes, gas is essential. If you want to actually make steel or you want to actually make concrete, you need gas, but you don't need a huge amount of it. I also think that we need to think more holistically, because what we need is African countries to really strategize and help each other with education. Because what you need is a population that's educated, they're trained, they have the skills to build the infrastructure themselves. What you don't want is foreign companies coming in and actually building it for you, and then you have to actually take out a service contract for the next 30 years for them to service it. Africans should be looking after African power for African people, for African economy. And I think that's key. And I think if we can get that over to policymakers and go, look, invest in your own country, invest in your amazing people, that's the way to go. That's all I want to say. Sorry.
Mark, thank you so much for chipping in there. That was really, really useful. Right. Thank you, Linus. We're going to move on very quickly now because we've got so many more questions to bring in. Linus, we're just going to, we'll come back to you towards the end if we have a little bit more time, but we've got a lot of questions to get through. So next up, we're going to go to Francesca Kennedy-Wallbank. It's a pleasure to have you here for your first CCAG public meeting. Could you tell us briefly about what you do and the opportunities you see in a post-carbon future before then putting your first question to the panel?
Sure, will do. Thank you, Addy, and hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me here. As you mentioned, I'm Francesca, and I've got 7 years experience in predominantly the consumer goods sector at Unilever. And that's across supply chain and marketing. I'm currently actually the Digital Sustainable Choices Operations Lead at Unilever. So I'm really focused kind of on the consumer angle when it comes to decarbonisation. And I actually do that part-time, and full-time I work at Carbon 13. This is run out of Cambridge University, and their aim is to basically be the venture builder for the carbon emergency. And they invest in startups and entrepreneurs who they think really can listen to the change, but actually do the doing and make the change. And the area that I'm really interested in and think where I can add value is in the consumer angle and really closing that consumer say and consumer do gap. I've spent a lot of time looking at kind of scope 3 analysis in terms of like organizations and really pushing them forward. But I know there's a massive kind of gap on doing their analysis, setting aims, and then actually taking action, which that's the part that I'm really interested in exploring further. But I was going to ask a different question, but given the conversation that just happened, I think I'd really like to go back to another question that I had for you. And that's just when we are talking about energy in the post carbon in the world, we talked a lot there about the complications in terms of natural gas, and it sounds like it's more of like a development versus sustainability argument in Africa. I'm just wondering, if we do want to increase renewable energy, do you think and do you see that carbon tax is the best option to do the transition? And if so, do you have any opinions on how we manage carbon leakage?
Carbon tax and carbon leakage. I think we have like discussed this topic before, but it is a really interesting and important one. I think I'll go to Professor Mark Maslin for this one, actually.
Oh, thanks, Ade. Just throw the economy at me.
Hold on, Mark. We'll go to you in a minute. But first, I'll save you here. I'll save you here. I think Professor Laura Diaz-Anadon, you could take this one for us first and save Mark his blushes.
He can always, I'm sure he'll be able to add something to what I'm going to say. Thank you for the question, Francesca. So what we've seen in terms of what has made a difference in terms of getting low carbon technologies on the ground, improving the cost of technologies like batteries, solar panels, offshore wind farms, solid state lighting. It's been policies other than carbon taxes. So in terms of the experience that we have, it's been a combination of regulations and fiscal incentives that have allowed companies, inventors, and consumers, right, to have access to low carbon technologies that were considered very expensive. And as Sir David mentioned, some of the cheapest sources of energy today in the UK and in other places, when you just look at the levelized cost of electricity, they are these technologies that used to be 10,000 times, like solar used to be 10,000 times more expensive than it is today. However, we do know, so I'm talking about the evidence of what has really accelerated the development, deployment, and cost reductions in key technologies. So we need to learn these lessons, and we have a report that we just published last week in the Economics of the Energy Innovation Transition Project, where we go through these 30 years of policies that have accelerated the development and deployment of technologies. But we also know that we have carbon taxes or carbon trade systems in the world today in many places, including, of course, in the European Union, in various parts of the US. Around 22% of emissions are covered by some sort of cap and trade or carbon tax. And what we do know from that experience is that they have made a difference in terms of reducing emissions, not as much as we would like, partly because prices tend to be low. So there is a role, in my view, and then we have published a report on this, I think it was in August, for carbon taxes. I think as we get deeper into decarbonization, the role of carbon prices and carbon taxes is going to become even more important, because we'll begin to need solutions in areas that are not obvious, and the connections between sectors will be essential, and carbon prices can send those signals. But I think we cannot, at this moment in time, solely rely on carbon taxes as the way to get us there. What has worked right now with these various energy technologies that we should apply to net zero steel, to aviation, and to various other options, is this combination of sustained policies that both fund demonstration, provide cheap financing, and fiscal incentives. On the leakage point, again, now because prices have been relatively low, we, in some energy intensive traded commodities, there's a little bit of evidence of leakage. And again, this is a problem that will become bigger over time, and we'll see a greater role for high carbon taxes. So I think they're a little bit complementary. I think depending on where you are in the history of the decarbonization path in a sector, I think carbon taxes may have a bigger role later on.
Thank you, Professor Laura Diaz-Anadon, for that extensive answer. I think Dr. Fatima Denton, you also wanted to chip in here on carbon leakage and taxes as well.
Yeah, thanks, Ade. Just on the carbon leakage question, I wanted to say, again, a lot of what I say is also very much dependent on the research we do and the people we talk to. So a number of the people we talk to feel that leakage, first of all, I think we need to, let me say this, we need to say, where's the source of the leak? Where's the leak coming from, right? I think it's a very important question. If we are slapping taxes on countries that can least afford to pay those taxes because it's seen as a leakage problem, and essentially it's about also a mitigation burden that some countries are placing on others. If you look at the carbon border adjustment mechanism of the EU, yes, it's really a wonderful thing that the EU is trying to do in terms of gaining carbon neutrality by 2050. But it's also about the EU's mitigation burden that it is placing on countries that do not have the carbon footprint to be taxed. So it's in many ways not quite fair. They're not the big producers of steel. They're not the big producers of the products that are going to cause the leak. So they have to manage. They have to now be faced with higher penalties because of the fact that they're still getting their emissions under control. So I think that there's ultimately an equity issue around those who have powers to slap the taxes on those who haven't, and to demand that before product enters a particular zone, it has to be free of emissions. And these countries are very much trying and coping with products themselves that, as I said before, are not the products that are the culprits. They're not the products that are causing the leak. So it really all depends on how we view. If carbon leakage is a euphemism for penalty and for protectionism, then we have a problem.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point there, Dr. Fatima Denton. I mean, the issue of tax and fairness is historically been very problematic. Professor Mark Maslin, do you want to come in now? Are you ready now?
So, yeah, thank you for giving me time to actually think. I have to say, I think that carbon taxes are unfortunately a very blunt tool because you don't necessarily tax who or what you want. So, for example, maybe I own a factory that makes titanium ball bearings, okay? It has a high carbon footprint, it has a lot of energy use. Do you tax me? Well, hang on, 50% of my product goes into wind turbines and is exported to Africa. Do you want to tax me or not? The other half, admittedly, goes into diesel cars. That's bad. So it's very blunt. I mean, in many ways, what we want to do is actually incentivize. So perhaps we should be looking at not taxing, but removing fossil fuel subsidies, actually freeing up money and allowing the markets to take place. Because as Laura said, and others have always pointed out, at the moment, fossil fuels are expensive to actually build, run, and actually maintain, whereas renewables are a lot cheaper. I also think that we need to go back into the actual system and say, what do we need to change? So one of the incredible reports that came out last year and papers from UCL pointed out that if you're a least developed country and you want to have a big loan for infrastructure, the banks, international banks and countries will charge you more for renewables than they will for a coal-fired power station. And when we pointed this out to bankers went, really? Oh, really? Oh, well, we haven't looked at our models. So again, really strangely, just changing the percentage by basically saying all banks have to lend at a slightly lower rate for renewables than coal-fired power stations or gas even, suddenly you change the whole market dynamics without having to tax and actually skew things. And as Fatima said, tax, unfortunately, is one of those weapons that's used for protectionism and sort of like as an aggressive tool against other countries.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly there, Professor Mark Maslin. So David King, I see you've got your hand up as well. So Dave, can you unmute yourself, please?
I want to separate out the question of carbon leakage from carbon tax. I agree with everything Mark just said. But I think in terms of carbon leakage, let's just bear in mind that methane is an instantaneous impact on climate change, 130 times greater per molecule than carbon dioxide. And so this business of the amount of methane leaking into the atmosphere is critically important. And my own response to carbon leakage, for example, coal mines. We still have coal mines, old coal mines in Britain, disused. We're not using coal anymore, but nevertheless, those coal mines are a source of carbon leakage. What we need to do is convert that carbon leakage, the methane, into carbon dioxide. So we're looking at processes, photocatalysis, catalytic processes that will convert the methane very efficiently. There is a little problem. and that is that a large amount of the methane escaping into the atmosphere comes from the farming industry, and in particular, of course, from livestock, although rice is another source of carbon. So we know that as the well-being of the population improves, so does the demand for more livestock and more meat, etc. So this is a problem that can only be dealt with by human behavior change. It's a very big challenge. And then finally, explosive release of methane from the permafrost regions of the Arctic Circle is already taking place, particularly during the polar summer months. And we need to focus on how we can stop that process by learning how to refreeze the Arctic. So there's a whole set of challenges under that question of carbon leakage.
Yeah. I mean, we have to look at this in a holistic manner. So Dave, as you mentioned there, yes, the social aspects are important, but we cannot escape from the science, and that stat of methane being so much more lethal than CO2 is such an important one. Francesca, thank you for sparking such a powerful and interesting discussion. I know, Laura, you wanted to add something, but we do need to move on because we've got some more questions to get in there. But thank you, Francesca. I'm going to move on to our next guest. That's Camilla Tormin. I hope I'm pronouncing your surname right, Camilla.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, Camilla, it's great to have you here today. Could you please tell us a little bit more about your work at the Institute for Environment and Development and share your question with the group?
Great. Well, thank you very much. Very interesting discussion so far. So I'm currently working with the Africa-Europe Foundation on issues around energy, climate, and agri-food, where we're trying to build dialogues and action, bringing African and European colleagues together so that we can find common ways forward to dealing with our problems. I've spent the last 40 years of my professional life as an economist working on various different aspects of African development, particularly in West Africa and the Sahel, on land, agriculture, and climate, and really trying to get evidence and ideas into policy and practice, working closely with African colleagues like Fatima, to try and make sure that their ideas and influence can help shape policy within different government systems. And I start from a very bottom-up perspective, having followed a particular village in Mali for the last 40 years to try and understand how some of the big picture influences affect life on the ground. My question was prompted by watching the recent launch of Nigeria's Just Energy Transition Plan. And if you Google that, you can all have the pleasure of doing that. It's really fascinating. Mm-hmm. So just and affordable energy transition plans for Africa are being proposed by the Egyptian presidency for COP27. The Nigerian one is a particularly forward-looking and well-developed example, which others are now starting to follow. Given the huge diversity between different African countries, what do you think are the core elements and the core principles that you'd like to see in any such transition plan?
What a brilliant question, Camilla. And I will Google that, Nigeria being the country of my birth. I'm fascinated to see what they're doing with their Just Transition Energy Plan. I'm going to give this question, first of all, to Dr. Fatima Denton. I'd love to hear your perspective on this.
Thank you very much, Camilla. So core elements of what the plan should look like. I guess there are some very stubborn issues that have been resurfacing over every COP. We have these issues, and we haven't really managed to solve them. So I would say a transition plan for me that doesn't look at the finance aspect in terms of how we're going to support countries in Africa. And as you said, they're not all speaking with the same voice right now, but that's where we need to get to. So I would say the finance aspect in terms of finance to be able to do adaptation, because that's still a very core important part of climate action. And for many countries in Africa, it's, how they cope with floods, which is, becoming a regular occurrence. So I think in the same way that we're talking about a mitigation goal, we should also have an adaptation goal. And we should also be able to put, commensurate funding into adaptation to support many of the countries in Africa build their climate resilience. So that I think is the backbone of any plan, because most African countries are very land-based. They've got, it's a land-based system. They very much rely on agriculture and land. And as you know, Camilla, that's degrading at a faster rate. So we need to see more investment and more funding going to that. It's certainly critical for us to think about the energy sector. And a lot of what we've said today would resonate with many countries in Africa, that this energy deficit that they have been faced with and are still faced with and will follow them for a long time. We need to see how we can plug the gap on that one. There are potential impacts that climate action would also mean for the petrochemical industry, which is important to many countries in Africa. So how do we address some of those problems relating to petrochemicals? A lot of where energy investments are right now, if you think about the carbon intensive industries like cement, like steel, construction, those are very big challenges for Africa, because it does have a concentration of a lot of the needs that the continent has. So I would say support in how we plug the energy gap, but how we also do so in a way that doesn't affect some of these other industries, these other alternatives that we have. And yes, if everybody's talking about the potential for other sources of energy like hydrogen, how do we make that happen? But how do we make it happen? I think the one fear I have, and some people have expressed this, is that if countries in the West are going to look to source hydrogen resources, we should be very careful so that those resources are not resources that will benefit a certain part of the world, and another part of the world is really kept, energy insufficient and energy poor. So if you're going to buy hydrogen from South Africa, because to a large extent that is going to bring energy sufficiency to, it's going to support energy sufficiency in Germany, we should be careful not to ensure that South Africans are supporting a clean trajectory for Germany, but are not necessarily on that pathway as well. So there are those things that I would say need to be carefully considered. But the transition would not look the same for everyone, because there are many parts of the transition. Some countries are way in green economy even before this whole NDCs, nationally determined contributions, became fashionable. So they had a whole of economy, whole of government, whole of society approach, which was very much embedded in their, civil service, public administration. They looked at it from all sectors. And they were very far ahead of all the other countries, because they had already started this process. There are countries like Rwanda as well that have also made key advances in terms of their own climate resilient future, and Mozambique. to a large extent. So, you know, there are more countries, you know, there are more countries than those three. But definitely, I think we should look at those examples of where they've gotten to. Some of the countries in North Africa as well have made revolutionary steps. Tunisia, Morocco, even Egypt as well, in terms of getting their transition levers in place. So it's not necessarily starting from scratch, but we should also appreciate that, especially if we're thinking about Africa, that what I would say what we need before we even start talking about the transition is to get our climate leadership in place. I think that this is something that is going to be fundamentally important. Climate leadership and the governance of it, and how it's designed and how it's supported and enabled is hugely important to getting some of those things right. And we have lost a little bit of the dynamism that went with that leadership. So we need to see that leader. Do we have a vision of what we want to see? Part of why we were talking about this after initiative is because we felt that that vision was lacking. So you don't want to be in a situation of perennial vulnerability where you say we're vulnerable, we're vulnerable. At one stage, you need to shake off that vulnerability and start thinking about what is it that you want in terms of investment markets, you know, job creation. And how do you want to do that? You know, where should you start looking? How should you, you know, I mean, we need to, I think we need to be very deliberate and very decisive with the kind of future we want, because this is a future that we have to design ourselves. We might get support, but it's what Mark was saying, it's predominantly a future that has to be designed by Africans, and then look for support, you know, where support might come from.
Great. Thank you so much. And it's such an important answer. You know, it should be designed by Africans, and leadership is so important. I want to quickly go to Dr. Arunabha Ghosh, who wants to chip in on this as well, please.
First of all, thank you, Camilla, for your question. And I will certainly not try to respond to this suggesting as if I'm an Africa expert. But since you asked a question about the big principles, I just want to outline two big principles that I think should apply to not just Africa, but other developing countries as well. One is structural adjustment, and the second is structural resilience. Now, structural adjustment has a long history of suggesting that developing economies haven't really sorted out their macroeconomic policies, which results in their lack of competitiveness, poorly designed trade policies, and so on and so forth, which then results in underdevelopment, and therefore there is this call for structural adjustment. But what I mean by structural adjustment is different. What we are looking for is not, aid or assistance just for reducing the development gap. What is really needed is a structural adjustment in the nature of global finance, because it is not Africa's fault that the climate is changing. It is not Vietnam's fault that the climate is changing. It is not Bangladesh's fault that the climate is changing. It is, of course, well recognized that it is everyone's responsibility now to step up and do much more than what they think they can do to tap into the technological advances that have been made. But as I've said on numerous CCAG briefings, money does not flow where the sun shines the most. And that is because of not structural adjustment lacking in developing countries. It is structural adjustment that has not happened in global finance. And unless we move the development banks, the development financial institutions, and the institutional investors to not just complain that there aren't any investable projects, but actually make it a mandate for them to go look for those projects, and if they don't exist, to create those projects, we will continue to have this inequity in where the projects are needed, the infrastructure is needed, and where the finance flows. Equally, the second big principle has to be about structural resilience. What we have in terms of financial support against shocks is that if a pandemic hits, someone gives out a little bit of a loan to provide some vaccines, and even those don't come enough. If a storm hits, someone gives out some catastrophe humanitarian assistance. But actually, economies don't work or don't have the choice of having one crisis at a time. We are in a world of perfect storms of shocks, which means that the pandemic and a food crisis and a financial crisis and a fuel crisis all comes together. And that then makes the macro economy, not just the energy sector, not just the farming sector, far more vulnerable with far little room for maneuver. So again, whether it's an African country or a developing economy somewhere else, it's the reform in global finance to provide structural resilience so that you can actually leverage your macroeconomy for the long-term development plans that Fatima and Ade was saying that can be nationally owned. But unless we look at these structural flaws, we will be using only band-aid solutions, and we would continue to have at best, paternalistic approach towards the development of 5.5 billion people on the planet.
Yeah. That was excellent, Dr. Aranava. Gosh, giving us a real reality check if we want to move on. But listen, we have sadly come to the end of this month's session. I want to say a big thank you to Linus, Francesca, and Camilla, who asked some great questions. Another great session full of fascinating insight on a really important topic. Thanks to everyone for tuning into our live stream. If you have any questions for our scientists, please do get in touch via our social media channels. And we look forward to seeing you again at our final CCAG public meeting before COP27 at the end of October. Bye-bye for now.
The situation with climate change is clear. The crisis is not being managed in the way it needs to be managed at the moment. I am Sir Dave King. I have set up a climate crisis advisory group. The group represents the international experts on climate change to be available to the public, to policymakers, and to the media around the world. We need action now. What we as humanity do over the next 5 years will, in my view, determine the future of civilization.